Hi, my name is Liz Lowe, and I'm a procurement professional working for the province of BC. We're here to talk about what is the short form request for proposals. What is this all about? What do I need to know about the SRFP? So if you are a vendor who is interested in responding to an SRFP, it's very important that you understand the structure of this document. What information is in here that's going to be critically important for you? So looking at the SRFP, we have one up on the screen here that's a sample SRFP for the superhero event planning. Obviously not something we're really going to do, but it's a great example to step you through what an SRFP would include. So at the top of the document, you're going to see the title, and you're going to know which ministry or government organization issued this particular SRFP. In this case, it's the Ministry of Advanced Community Activities. It's then going to tell you the date it was issued. In this case, April 9th. 2014. And the SRFP number. That number is critically important for anything that you do with your SRFP. If you're sending in a question, if you're submitting a proposal, anything like that, you always want to quote the SRFP number. So make sure you know what that is. Going from there, you'll see the next thing is the closing time. In this case, May 7, 2014, before 2 p.m. local time. This is critically important information. If your proposal arrives late, it cannot be considered. Doesn't matter why it was late. If it arrives late, there's nothing that we can do. We have to reject your proposal. And pay careful attention to the date and the time. It says before 2 p.m. If your proposal arrives at 1:59 p.m. on May 7th, you're just fine. You've made it on time. If your proposal arrives at 2 p.m. on the dot, it is late because it did not come before, and we have to reject it. And this is just how the mandatory requirements work for any competitive procurement process across Canada. We then go to the closing location. Now, the SRFP is going to tell you how to submit your proposals. In this case, we're asking for 2 hard copies and 1 copy on CD, DVD, or USB. Okay? And that just enables us to use your electronic copy to search for documents, and if you're successful, to help us create the contract that will result. Okay. The other option, you'll see it says or. It then says 1 complete electronic proposal received in accordance with the BC bid instructions. This particular SRFP then is giving you an option. You can submit in hard copy or through the e-bidding option that's available on BC Bid. Okay. Some RFPs are only going to give you one option. Some might be e-bid only, some might be hard copies only, but it'll tell you, every SRFP is going to tell you what it is that you should be doing to submit your proposal. But note the next line, proposals must not be submitted by fax, email, or mail. Pay close attention to that. Again, it's a mandatory requirement. We can only accept your proposal if it's on time and comes in the way that's permitted described in the SRFP. So if you send it by fax or by email or by mail, you're going to have that proposal rejected. The next line talks about the government contact. So this is the individual that you would need to get a hold of if you had any questions about the SRFP. It's going to give you a name, a title, an email address, and a fax number. Now, keep in mind, there's a reason there's no phone number here. We don't want you calling the government contact person. We want everything to be in writing, and that just ensures that we know exactly who asked us what and when, and that our responses are done in writing, available for everybody. We'll talk a little bit later about how you get your questions answered. Asking them, though, it's very important only to go to the government contact person. Please don't go to somebody else you might know in the ministry who may or may not know about this SRFP. You can't rely on the information that comes from any other source than the government contact. Finally, in this heading section, you'll see that it talks about the terms and conditions that apply to the SRFP, or the SRFP rules. This is a link that if you click on will take you to a website that has all the terms and conditions that apply. Look at that next line. When you submit a proposal to the SRFP, you're agreeing to be bound by the SRFP rules. So it's very important that you go to the website, you have a look at what's there, and you ensure you understand all of the terms and conditions or rules that apply to the SRFP. That makes sure there's no surprises for you. And if anything doesn't make sense, if there's questions you have about the SRFP rules, by all means, that's something you should be sending into the government contact, whatever your question is. So now that we've gone through all of the heading information on the SRFP And we really emphasize the importance of the information you can find there. Let's move on and look to the various sections that you'll see in the SRFP. And we'll start off with Section 1, which is Contract Services. So Section 1 is going to explain exactly what it is that the ministry is looking for the contractor to do. The first paragraph is going to be starting with a blanket statement, a very basic overview of what those services are. In this case, we need a contractor to plan and deliver an event within the Victoria, BC downtown core. Now, I'm not going to go through every word or detail that's in this section because, as we know, this is a sample SRFP. It's for services that the province would never actually go to SRFP for. But there are sections in this contract services that we need to talk about. So you'll see then after the overview, we start to get into more detail. And in particular, look at this section that starts the contractor will. This describes the exact services that the contractor resulting from the SRFP is going to deliver. And you'll see that that language, the contractor will, is written at the same way it would be written in the contract. In fact, the intent is that when we award the contract to our successful proponent to the SRFP, that this is the language that's going to be included in the contract itself. Very important that you read exactly everything that this says. If there's anything here that's problematic, that isn't going to work, or that's contradictory in some way, those are the ideal questions that you should be asking the government contact person. We don't want to make this difficult for the contractor or cause problems for the ministry later because there's something in this language that is problematic. Ask the questions. Why is it worded this way? Or suggest something that you think would work better. Keeping in mind that it'll be the ministry's choice whether or not to take your suggestions or to make any changes. And if changes are made, they're made for everybody, not just for whoever it was that asked. Everyone would be playing with exactly the same set of contractor responsibilities. Everybody would be bidding on the same thing. So in this particular case, we have a number of items that are constituting the actual deliverables for the contract. There's actually 11 of them. You want to read each and every one, make sure it makes sense to you. If there's anything confusing, anything that's ambiguous, by all means ask the question, get the clarity that you need so you know exactly what it is that you are submitting a proposal on. In this particular sample, you'll see it then goes on to talk about what the ministry will do. So the ministry will confirm availability, etc. Not every SRFP is going to be structured in this way, but some will be, where it's clear the contractor is responsible for these things and the ministry is going to be doing these other things, so that you've got that separation of duties. We don't have anything that falls between the cracks because the contractor thought the ministry was doing it and the ministry thought the contractor was doing it. Now, if the SRFP you're looking at does not include any information on what the ministry will do, or it's confusing as to where something would fit under the contractor responsibilities or the ministry responsibilities, again, great thing to ask your government contact person. Get the clarity that you need for that particular issue. Now, in this particular SRFP, you'll see this last line about the reserving the right to negotiate a second event. This is going to be an unusual sentence to find in an SRFP. SRFPs usually are for services with very defined scopes. In this particular case, however, we wanted to have an option to extend the contract or to hire the contractor to do exactly the same services but for a separate event. But we weren't sure that this second event was actually going to happen, and that's why you're seeing this right to negotiate in the SRFP. Keep in mind that nothing really is negotiable in the SRFP unless it's stated in so many words that, yes, this is what we're going to negotiate. Now, you'll then note that there's a little bit of blank space here. The SRFP itself is developed as a smart form. The ministry who's writing it is using the smart form to put it together. And the smart form has a specific amount of space for this particular section. It's usually the longest section in any SRFP. The reason for this is that the SRFP itself must be no longer than 2 pages, and this way the ministry knows exactly how much room that they have. In this particular sample, we could have talked a little bit more about the services if there was something more we had to say, or if it turns out we're writing something that's making the document longer than 2 pages, the smart form will stop us from doing that and we'll have to edit things back. But don't be alarmed if you do see SRFPs with a bit of blank space. It just simply means that the ministry had more room, they just didn't need it. So let's move on then to Section 2, the contract format. Every SRFP is going to tell you exactly what form of contract will be used if you are the successful proponent. What is it you're expected to sign? There are two options. Either the General Services Agreement, which is what the sample is doing, or there might be a customized contract that would be attached as an Appendix B to the SRFP. And one or the other is going to be your contract format. In either case, it's very important that you read the contract format and you understand what all of the terms and conditions attached mean for you. If there's anything that is a question that you have or something that you'd like to change, by all means, ask that question for your government contact person. And again, the ministry will decide whether such changes will be allowed, and if they're allowed, it would apply to everybody, not just the person asking. But you need to understand that after the SRFP closes, if you've submitted a proposal and you're offered the contract, you will not have the option of changing the contract terms and conditions at that point. Your only opportunity to look at those to request changes is while the SRFP is open. So be very clear on what your contract format is saying. Now in this sample, we're using the General Services Agreement, and you'll see there's a link to the website that contains that agreement. Then you'll see it goes on a little bit about other things. One of them is additional insurance. In the General Services Agreement, if you were to go to that website, you would see that there's some insurance that's spelled out, and then there's some language about whether or not additional insurances are needed. So in the SRFP, it clearly spells out what additional insurance might be required, or is required in this case. If no additional insurances are required, it would simply state that, no additional requirements for insurances. Now, there are other schedules in the General Services Agreement that are optional. One of them is Schedule F, Additional Terms. If Schedule F applies, it would be attached as Appendix B to the SRFP, and you would know exactly what those additional terms would be. In our sample, additional terms do not apply, so we simply say Schedule F does not apply. Now, Schedule E, which is the privacy schedule, and Schedule G, the security schedule, these are fully written out schedules in the General Services Agreement, and they either apply in their entirety or they don't apply at all. And in our sample, you'll see that both E and G do apply. So now you know to read those schedules because they will be included in the contract that results. The final sentence under contract format talks about the term of the contract. So this is the length of time that we expect the contract to last. This is critically important information because you are bound to the proposal that you have submitted to the SRFP for the term of the contract. So in our sample, we're looking at a 6-month contract that's going to be starting on July 2nd. And then you'll see we've got this ability to have options to extend. Now, not every SRFP contract will have options to extend, but some will. And of course, in this case, remember that we had that ability to negotiate a second event, so it makes sense that we probably want options to extend our contract in the event that we're going to actually deliver on that second event. So we have our 6 one-month options. That gives us some flexibility depending on when we might want to schedule that event and how long it might take to get everything in place from the contractor's perspective. But note, it is at the sole discretion of the ministry, and that means you can't guarantee that those options to renew are going to be offered to our contractor. And if you have any questions about the circumstances by which such a decision would be made, again, perfect thing to be asking your government contact. So now let's move on to Section 3 questions. So I've spent a whole bunch of time here talking about when you should ask questions and what you should be asking questions about. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means, what that process looks like. So in Section 3, it tells you, again, as we've talked about earlier, that if you do have questions, they need to be sent in writing to the government contact. That was the individual that was named in the heading section of the SRFP. And we need to get those questions before the closing time. Okay. Now, depending on how the SRFP is issued, then that would determine how we're going to be answering questions. So in the sample, the SRFP is going to be posted on BC Bid. So answers to the questions then will also be posted on BC Bid. And you'll note that it says may be posted. The reason for that, sometimes we get questions that have already been answered. And so rather than posting something new on BC Bid, we might just tell the proponent asking where they can find the answer to the question that they're looking for. Other times we get questions that are received too close to the closing time to be able to answer. So that's why we say we may post on BC Bid. We do everything we can to answer the questions that come in, but if we get a question coming in too late, it may be that the proponent will be told that, sorry, we just haven't got time to answer that. The next line talks about information from any other source. So if you happen to find something out, perhaps you've worked with a ministry in the past and you've talked to somebody who's working for that ministry and they give you something about the SRFP, keep in mind that that information is not official. You cannot rely on it. And I've actually personally seen circumstances where a proponent has missed a mandatory requirement, meaning that we didn't even read their proposal because they didn't pay attention to this. They spoke to somebody in the ministry who gave them information that should never have been given, and at the end of the day, they relied on it and it cost them the contract. Now, some SRFPs are going to have a cutoff time for your questions. Not all will, but some will. And you'll see in our sample, it says that we're going to be accepting questions up to 4 days prior to closing time. That's why it's very important as a proponent that you read the SRFP in its entirety as early as possible and you submit your questions as early as possible. That gives the ministry more time to develop the answers, and once the questions are distributed, or the questions and the answers are distributed, it gives all of the proponents more time to incorporate that additional information. Now, some SRFPs are not going to be posted on BC Bid. They're going to be directed to specific vendors. So, for example, perhaps the ministry has a qualified supplier list and they're doing an SRFP that is only being directed to those qualified suppliers. If that's the case, we're not going to be posting answers to questions on BC Bid because the SRFP would not have been posted there. In that case, we're going to be sending the questions and answers to all of our invited proponents. So if you're invited to a competition, an SRFP that has been restricted to a qualified supplier list, or that the contract is under $75,000 and the ministry has chosen 3 or more vendors to participate, in that case you'll see the language a little bit different here in terms of how you're going to get answers to questions. So moving on then to Section 4, Requirements for Proposals, and this is something that you're going to see in every single SRFP. And that says that proponents must submit their proposals in the form of the SRFP proposal form attached as Appendix A. Critically important. This means you must use the Appendix A, and the next video is going to talk how to fill one of those out. What's really important though is that you cannot take Appendix A and put it into your own document and manipulate it however you want to manipulate it and submit that. That's going to be very problematic. That would likely result in a failed mandatory. We wouldn't even read your proposal. So make it easier on yourself and easier on us. Always use Appendix A when you're responding to an SRFP. The next sentence is also really important in this section. The SRFP itself in Appendix A is going to be providing all kinds of information about what you are to provide as a proponent. Now, if there are attachments that are specifically requested or website URLs specifically requested, then absolutely you need to ensure you include those attachments or those URLs. However, if the SRFP does not specifically ask for attachments or URLs, don't send them in because the ministry won't be able to look at them. The ministry is only going to be looking what's in the proposal form. So carefully follow those instructions. And if it looks to you like an attachment or a URL should have been asked for and was not, again, a perfect thing to be asking your government contact so that they can provide the clarity on whether or not they're going to be considering attachments or URLs. Okay. Section 5 then moves on to talk about mandatory requirements. Now, I've been talking about the importance of being on time, the importance of using the Appendix A, and these are all part of our mandatory process requirements. And you'll see in Section 5, it says that you must, as a proponent, meet all the mandatory process requirements that are in the SRFP rules. So the SRFP rules, if you go to that website, are specifically going to be telling you that your proposal must be on time, that you must use Appendix A, it must be in English, etc. There's a number of process rules that you need to follow that are mandatory requirements. You want to make sure you know what they are and that you follow them diligently. Remember, if you miss a mandatory requirement, we have to reject your proposal. We can't even read it. Now, some SRFPs may have one more mandatory requirement that's specific just to this SRFP. If that applies, this is where you're going to find it. In our sample, you'll see that there's certain experience we're looking for. So proponents must have experience working with at least one of the named superheroes. That's our mandatory requirement for our sample. Some SRFPs will have no additional mandatory requirement, in which case this section will only be referencing the mandatory process requirements in the SRFP rules. There won't be anything else to say in this section. So pay close attention to Section 5. Find out if there's anything additionally that you have to meet as a mandatory requirement for this particular SRFP. So let's move on then to Section 6, Proposal Evaluations, because this is going to be a section of the SRFP that's going to be of particular interest to you. In this section, you're going to find a table that describes how we're evaluating our weighted criteria. So basically it means that the proposals that have met all of our mandatory requirements, we are then going to evaluate for the weighted criteria that we've identified in Appendix A. And you'll see in our sample we have 3 headings: experience, approach, and price. Very typical kinds of headings. However, the SRFP that you're looking at may have different headings in this section, and that's just fine. What's important to note, though, is that the headings here are going to be exactly the same as the ones in Appendix A, and you'll see that in the next video. If the SRFP writer decides they want different headings, experience and approach perhaps don't work, they want to call them something else, they would make the change while they are building their SRFP, and if they make the change here in this table, it automatically changes the heading in Appendix A. So what that means for you as a proponent, if I'm looking at experience and I see that it's got a weight of 40 points altogether, then I know I can go to Appendix A and I'm going to see exactly that same heading, experience, and everything under that heading, that's what's weighted 40 points. So it really provides some clarity on how it is that we've weighted the SRFP sections. So in this case, we have experience, approach, and price, and you'll see we have one minimum score, and it applies to approach. So in this case, 30 points overall is available in approach, and the proponents must meet a minimum score of 18 to be considered further. So basically that means that if we're evaluating your proposal and you do not meet that minimum score under approach, then we are not going to be able to consider you for the contract. You have missed a requirement of the SRFP. Now, to be clear though, under approach there might be a number of things that we're looking for. If you don't have to meet absolutely 100% of everything in order to meet that minimum score, and our next video will talk a little bit more about that. But what is important is that overall you've met that minimum score. So it might be under approach in our sample that there are places that you are very well versed in, you know exactly how this works, and you give us a very thorough response to, and other areas that are a bit grayer for you, you're not entirely certain, maybe there's options or that could be worked out with the ministry as to how you want to deliver that, so your answer might not be as straightforward and as strong, and you might not score as well for those little areas. That's okay, as long as overall in this section you meet the minimum score. Now, if there are no minimum scores in this box for an SRFP that is of interest to you, that means that there are no minimum scores at all. The ministry has to disclose any minimum scores that do apply. Now, if you just scroll down a little bit here, we're still under evaluations. We talk some about the price. So there are lots of options to SRFPs. In some cases, we are going to be asking just for one price. Some cases, we're going to be asking for multiple prices. And by the way, some SRFPs are not going to be asking for price at all. Some maybe have only 2 sections to them, and some, rather than price, they're going to be asking about budget. So then we'll talk more about that in the other video. But if price is going to be evaluated, you need to know how is it going to be evaluated. So in this particular example, we're looking at more than one price, but we're evaluating each price separately. So they'll each be done on their own, and we've given you a formula. Here's the formula that we will use. And this formula basically, it means that the lowest price gets all the points, and everybody else is prorated on how close they got to the lowest price. It's a very typical formula. Now, there are other options on how price might be evaluated. What's important to note, though, is the SRFP is going to tell you, and you just need to have a look at that, read that, and if it doesn't make sense, again, ask the contact person to provide the clarity that you need. Now, finally, at the end of our sample, you'll see the sentence, this paragraph that begins, proponents should assume. This is a section on assumptions. Not all SRFPs will have them, but sometimes we need proponents to make an assumption for the purposes of delivering and developing their proposals. But we know that the assumptions may or may not be correct. So if that's the case, you're going to see it in the SRFP right at the bottom here, what those assumptions are. And so in our example, we know that superheroes can get a little carried away sometimes, that there might be damage that may happen to property, etc., if that were to happen. And apparently there's a superhero damages fund. So that's something that proponents might not actually know about. So we're making it clear that this thing exists. You should assume that the damage would be paid through that fund, unless, of course, it's something that the contractor did or failed to do that caused that damage to happen. And that is the entirety of the SRFP. It will always be no more than 2 pages. These headings will be the headings that you will see. There may be differences and options depending on the specific SRFP that you're looking at, but at the end of the day, you should have a fairly good understanding as to what's going to be included in the contract that's resulting, and a little bit on how the proposals are going to be evaluated. Our next video is going to be talking about the Appendix A, the document that you actually fill out. It's just really important that you've read the SRFP in its entirety and all the terms and conditions that apply and the SRFP rules before you start putting your proposal together, because you may find something in the SRFP or the rules or the terms and conditions that change how it is you're going to be answering some of these questions.